Welcome to The Technology Pill, a podcast that looks at how technology is reshaping our lives every day and exploring the different ways that governments and companies use tech to increase their power. My name is Gus Hossain, and I'm the Executive Director at Privacy International.
And I'm Caitlin, and I'm PA's Campaigns Coordinator. Hi.
In this edition, we're talking about the militarization of tech. I guess you can call it when tech goes to war, but it's both richer and darker than that. Fortunately, we're joined by two colleagues at PI who can take us through what is perhaps one of the biggest shifts in global tech and power that's happening right now, which includes the fact that big tech is shifting into war. But also there's this rise of massive investment in the defense tech industry, and how that defense tech industry isn't just trying to sell defense technology, but it's also getting into civilian life, and how there's a huge shift in the way that data is increasingly used in conflict, and then that data in conflict is then used to build technology that is then brought home to town squares in our civilian lives. In the conversation, because we're very fortunate to work with extraordinarily smart people, they refer to a number of terms from the sectors that they necessarily have to dive into. So for instance, they talk about the challenges of regulating dual-use technologies. And just to describe it as the type of technologies that can be used both in national security and warfare, but also civilian use. You can think of encryption as a dual-use technology. But that poses particular challenges around regulation when laws regulate governments differently and then they regulate conduct by individuals. And they also talk about, being legal nerds, different legal regimes. And so there are laws that regulate how governments can wage war. And there's a regime of law called international humanitarian law that they sometimes refer to as IHL. And there's also laws that essentially protect human rights. And there are gaps in between these legal systems. And navigating these gaps is also fascinating. And finally, they talk a lot about how national security as a term of art, or as a weapon as a term of art that governments use to shield themselves from accountability. So if a government doesn't want to talk about something, they'll say, oh, but for national security reasons, we cannot discuss the nature of our powers. And this is increasingly happening as our societies militarize. And that concept of militarization in societies is when our societies and our civilian life start taking on aspects of military life, of defense. And when that happens, governments get to use the excuse of national security to defend themselves from democratic norms and accountability measures. This all sounds very deep and this all sounds very ominous, but don't worry, if you hold on to the end, you'll find that there's a very rich discussion around hope and what good can come out of all of this fear and destruction and massive investments into defense tech and big tech.
I'm going to start asking this question. Who are you guys who've wandered into this meeting room at PI?
Hi, I'm Ilia. I'm a human rights lawyer currently leading PI's project on militarization of tech or technology. We are divided on that. And I've been working at PI for the past 7 years, primarily focusing on state accountability for surveillance practices. And I'm very happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Serhat Öztürk. I'm a legal officer at PI. I've been working on the areas of international human rights and humanitarian law, including in this project.
Awesome. And eagle-eyed listeners might remember Ilia from another podcast that she's definitely been on, but I can't remember the name of. So if you listen to this podcast and you're like, damn, I want to hear more from Ilia, you'll be able to find that podcast in the description box wherever you're listening or on our website. Ilia's shaking her head, but she's a delight. I don't know what anyone wants to know. So we're here today to talk about militarization, and like 2-ish years ago, this isn't a topic that we would be covering. It's not something anyone in particular was talking about, and now it's just about everywhere. So what was kind of the key moment for each of you where you realized something was starting to systemically change, that would be amazing.
Okay, what made the shift for me? No surprises there. It's Ukraine, as for don't want to say most of the globe, but many people. And it was one particular company's involvement that really struck to me on something that has been changing. And that was Starlink, primarily owned and controlled by Elon Musk. And Starlink has been providing Ukraine with internet access via its satellites from early on in the conflict. And back then, everybody had celebrated the moment where Starlink was coming in. Until the bill they provided to Ukraine. And so today, hospitals, military bases, and even troops on the front line have been using Starlink to connect, and even civilians have been using Starlink terminals to get Wi-Fi. And the more the conflict continues, the deeper the connection of Ukraine to Starlink is. And this is the first time a European state had made a contract with Starlink. But what it's particularly interesting for me in that case is the level of control one single company has over the connectivity of the entire state. It resembles to many ways to telecommunications companies, but telecommunications companies have entire infrastructures on the state. While right now, the Ukraine is facing the fact that with clicking one button, Starlink can simply cut the connection to the entire country. And there's been that incident in September 2022 where, there is a lot of speculation of what exactly happened, whether Elon Musk gave the order or what exactly was going on. But irrespective of how exactly it happened, the fact that all of a sudden, at the moment where the Ukraine was about to start a key operation for their military operations, the connection got cut. And there was nothing Ukraine could do about that. And this was what really triggered it for me, that the world is shifting and we need to shift our focus and work with it. Serhat, back to you.
Okay, thank you. I feel like it was not a precise moment in history for me, or it was not a particular event, but rather it was a process of learning and curiosity and concern. And now looking backwards, but also onwards, I feel like I should have known more and I should have predicted more. But I would say personally, what triggered my curiosity to look into this phenomenon is like at Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and other companies over the course of the last 10 years, there have been like workers objecting to certain involvement of these companies, right? I think it's regularly out there. There are always people who are putting on the table some humanitarian concerns. And it made me realize, what do these companies that I use on my phone, on my social media, or at best my work computer have to do with like conflict and war and occupation? So then I try to follow that question. And it feels like now everything is connected in a way around like the importance of having the most data. So I understand like how private companies and states have so many interconnected interests. So like if you look at the particular technologies around surveillance and those technologies that feed from data sets, you find pretty much the same technologies in war and occupation, but also in like countries at peace in the Western or whichever part of the globe you look at, like they're used in surveillance. So they're all the same in a way. I think that's my brief take on it, but I understand it's much more complex than that. So that's why we have a project on it.
And a podcast. Gus, what about you?
No, for me, it was when we were all wondering whether or not there was going to be a Ukraine war. You know, even as Macron, the French president, was saying, oh, no, we're still negotiating. This isn't going to happen. Peace is still possible. What I thought was fascinating was that the Americans, and I believe to some degree the British, were parachuting in to Ukraine to help patch critical infrastructure. In the old days, you imagine foreign governments parachuting in before an invasion to like build, trenches or to put mines around borders. But in this case, there was a story in the New York Times about how the US government was heading into Ukraine to do software patches to shore up the civilian infrastructure of Ukraine. Because if there was going to be a conflict, and apparently the Americans believed there was going to be a conflict, amongst the first wave of the attack was going to be the Russian intelligence agencies with their extraordinary hacking powers, essentially attacking the civilian infrastructure of the rail and the electricity and other things that are all accessible through digital means. And so it kind of indicated that war was changing and the defense against war was changing. And then once the conflict did occur, a key moment happened for us, which was we were trying to imagine if this is the nature of warfare now, that an element of civilian infrastructure that can be targeted in war, that applies to telecommunications systems too. And so we were wondering if Russia intends to actually invade and occupy, what does that mean for the data infrastructure in the country, particularly the telecommunications data infrastructure? That is, telephone companies that have vast amounts of data on people in a now occupied country. And that data can be used to target civilians. And then it becomes very dangerous. And so we wrote to the telecommunications companies that operate in Ukraine and asked them, do you have plans for this? And we didn't get a response, which is quite unfortunate. But it just forced this shifting in our minds of that, the infrastructure of modern telecommunications and modern intranet and the modern data world that we've built has always had this idea that was built to aid peace and understanding. And we were about to enter into a world of conflict and war. Arguably, war and conflict existed over the last 20 odd years. It was just unevenly distributed. Now the West was going to wake up to the reality that war was taking place and war was going to be different. So yeah, that was the moment when I turned to Ilia, and Ilia, I could see that she was having the exact same thoughts. Something was going on in the world. And so we wondered, what can we do about it? And then Ilia, fortunately, had all the answers. Right, Ilia?
Always.
So you said PI's got to work on this. What is this?
I mean, Caitlin said it at the very beginning. It's been 2 years ago. We wouldn't be considering working on this. And nowadays, everyone is talking about militarization and the need to modernize the militaries, from increase of defense budgets, militarization of AI goes on. Both of the two ongoing conflicts, one in Ukraine and one in Gaza, have been marked by how heavily technology focused the conversations and the news have been. And yet I felt when we were building the project, there is little consideration on what are the broader impacts of those trends to our everyday lives, something that Serhat hinted to as well when he was talking about what made an impact on him. And at the moment, in the process of modernizing the militaries, governments with company supports are rapidly militarizing our societies. They are increasing military spending while they are undermining civil rights protections and reducing social protection programs. And this is exactly what militarization of tech is for us. It is not only about the tech and data innovating how conflicts are conducted and how big tech from Microsoft, Google, Meta, and all the rest of them are not only chasing defense contracts in the US and beyond, but they have shifted their policies to ensure they can use our data for war and surveillance. Militarization of tech to us is also about how defense tech companies are now selling the products to be deployed in our day-to-day lives, in our town squares. And this is how we understood the change that was happening in the world, a change that was not only impacting the battlefield, but was impacting our town squares. And of course, I'm a lawyer, so half of my questions asked to Gus were about how this whole thing is governed. Where are the limits? What are the rules of engagement? Dual use products is not a new term. We see it in export controls. It's dominating war. It's not something new that defense and militaries will influence how technologies we use is developed. But then how is it regulated on the ground? and what are the protections we can have against our data being used in war and to target us. So this is how we conceptualize the project to begin with. That keeps taking more and more shape.
To dive a bit deeper into what you were saying, like, why is it different and why is it important? Like, dual-use technologies that are used in civilian spheres and military spheres, if they've been around a while, like, what makes this a systemic shift rather than a continuation of a trend that we've already kind of seen?
Much of this we have seen before, no doubt. Military tech projects offering commercial alternatives from touchscreens to GPS. These are things that were initially military projects. And military being involved in protecting critical infrastructures, that has also been part of the deal. They are there to protect us from external threats. So from electricity to water supplies, these are critical infrastructures they need to protect. Or companies marketing their products as being battlefield tested. This is their mark of marketing seal of approval that they know what they're talking about. But we believe that the nature and intensity of those intersection is changing. Data is becoming central to war. It is no longer just about collecting information to getting advantage over the enemy. The collection and processing of the data in itself is becoming a military operation. And in the process, they're using data-intensive, data-driven technologies. And those technologies require more and more data to be developed and operating. And as a result, it's no longer just about the battlefield data, about the military intelligence that it's gathered, but it is everybody's data. They are collecting data from big tech companies, from data brokers, from everything in our day-to-day lives. And this has, as a result, there is an ever deeper fusion on military and civil data, tech, infrastructures, as we have never seen before. Everything seems to be becoming a fair game.
I think you're nailing that analysis. It's like, for an organization like PI that cares about different forms of surveillance and different forms of data gathering, the use in war just completely transforms the surveillance power to begin with, but also the nature of conflict. So, in the past, we've looked at how governments will hack devices in order to get data out of those devices. Or we did some litigation when it was discovered because of Edward Snowden's disclosures that the UK government had hacked the Belgian telecommunications service to get access to vast amounts of data. Or we'd also done work on, say, a company like Clearview AI, which is a facial recognition firm that was scraping data from social media and other places in order to build its database to then sell to police. And then war happens, and it just completely transforms the landscape. Now using the example of Russia would have hacked the rail infrastructure or would have hacked the telecommunications infrastructure of Ukraine and would have then been able to understand the movements of people across the country. And so waging war against Ukraine would have been dramatically different. Or as we saw with the example of facial recognition, and this is a very dark example, but Clearview AI, after having lost case after case that we were behind some of them, decided to offer for free to the Ukrainian government its services. And the reason I say it's dark is because Clearview had scraped Russian social media, and so therefore had faces of Russians, which is Russian soldiers, and they were offering the service to the Ukrainian government purportedly to identify dead Russian soldiers. And so all of a sudden, these tools and these methods developed in so-called peacetime were going to transform war. And then, as Ilia was saying, we're seeing these companies and these solutions being battle tested, field tested in war, and they're going to be part of our civilian infrastructure going forward. We've seen, for instance, Israeli facial recognition firms start deploying this very same technology that was battle tested, and we know where that was battle tested. They're then selling that branded technology, and these firms are marketing to schools and to hospitals. And so all of a sudden, not only do you have an ethical question of technology developed in war then being deployed in civilian spaces and in our town squares, but you also have the question about what about the data and the data that essentially made these systems to be viable for selling. And the data is the blood of people. It's horrific.
Serhat, you did a presentation for PI staff and our partners fairly recently. And one of the things that you mentioned that I thought was really interesting and comes back to the data question is if data is a military asset and data centers are military targets. Is that something you want to talk a tiny little bit more about?
Yeah. So under international humanitarian law, civilians and civilian objects are protected against attacks. This is the main rule. And when we look at the most important assets today, as we are talking in this podcast, it also definitely includes data, like data sets. And there are two ways of looking at data, the data itself or the physical infrastructure where it is contained, right? But if we focus on data, there are still unanswered questions whether data counts as an object or as a property. And basically, this ambiguous situation of data as property or object also hinders its protection from attacks during armed conflict, but also confiscation and lawful use and its restrictions that are regulated under international humanitarian law. So just because it is not a physical element, the legal world has been discussing whether this concept of data enjoys such protection.
So my family pictures, if I'm starting to put them on Instagram, or my Google photos that Google are using as part of their whatever training programs, become potential military considerations.
Yeah, it is possible that a state or a non-state armed group attacks your data, so to say, or let's say data of mass importance to communities, such as economic data or medical data. And as a result, they may just very well argue that it is not protected under IHL, or it is justified, their attack is justified under the circumstances because there is not a heightened protection preventing such attacks.
And weird weaponry and weird attack vectors are becoming increasingly relevant. And you actually went to the UN to talk about killer robots recently. Is that something you can explain?
Yeah, I think killer robots is a great example of what we are talking about here in terms of these data-intensive technologies. There are so many valid concerns around killer robots, and what we mean by killer robots is this integrated technology into a weapon, which allows the weapon to autonomously, without significant human involvement, identify and engage with a target. But what we mean by engage is most potentially the act of killing, right? So there's a big ethical question of delegating the decision to kill to machines and algorithms. There's a question of security, of proliferation, because these systems are not as expensive as one could imagine, so they may end up threatening global and contextual regional peace initiatives. But at the end, there is also a big problem about data and privacy, and this is actually one of the reasons we are more and more present in these discussions, because it is impossible to build and develop these machines without the data sets. So we are trying to understand, analyze, and also ask everybody we meet the question of where does this data come from? And does it change hands? Does it help building technologies, on the one hand in war and conflict, but on the other hand, peacetime surveillance? Are they interchangeable? And so far, I'm afraid we don't have a clear answer, but I feel that our suspicion leads us towards the right direction. And just to add to it, there is indeed a process to ban and regulate autonomous weapon systems, what we call killer robots. But the discussion is bigger than that. Today we are discussing also military decision support systems that we have seen in use, especially in Gaza. And these kind of systems, as they only suggest profiles to be attacked, people to be attacked without engaging with them automatically, are not part of the discussion, and they operate with less protective frameworks, unfortunately.
People are interested. I think we've talked briefly about those systems on the podcast before, but could you explain a little bit more what you mean by those systems in use in Gaza? Like, what are they? How do they work?
So military decision support systems are systems based on, once again, vast amounts of data that profile people of interest or communities based on their behavior, based on their political affiliation, and many more sensitive information. So as a result of these profiling based on data, the tool offers the armies or non-state armed groups basically profiles to be targeted, because maybe they are showing patterns of suspicious activity, or maybe that's not even required. Maybe they're just profiled as affiliated to a certain group, or maybe it's being a man of a certain age that directly contributes to your targeting. So here we are talking about algorithmic systems that operate with very little oversight and accountability, that put another strain on respect for international law.
There was one example that we discussed in a previous podcast. I think it was Washington Post and New York Times was identifying slightly the inverse challenge, which was in order to target neighborhoods in Gaza, the Israeli armed forces were relying on telecommunications data to identify that there were fewer people in the neighborhood. So they said, look, there's fewer mobile phones pinging the telecommunications tower, so therefore it's okay to proceed with the attack. They didn't include in their calculation that a lot of phones may not be connecting because the batteries had run dry and there was no electricity. Or there might be problems with the telecommunication system because it had also been attacked. And so the lack of data was being used to justify military action as well, and that could have its own problems.
What Serhat and Gas were just describing, and what it's highly problematic, is the layers of opaqueness that come with these transformations. We have always been facing the national security walls when it comes to law enforcement and counterterrorism, but at the same time, there are processes in place where we can question what is happening, what tools they've been using, and how they're getting their information to criminally prosecute people when it comes to arrests. And with these current developments and the identification of warfare, it feels to me that it's becoming this layer over layer of everything is becoming a matter of national security. We cannot draw the line. Our health data, our school data, our social media interactions, our silly time we spend to relax, are all becoming part of the package that can feed into the military's action. And that means that, for instance, an organization like PI that is promoting freedom and autonomy and dignity cannot actually be asking these questions anymore. We cannot find out what's happening with this data and how it's been transferred to the military and where the military transfers them next. So we may become the target of the next conflict, but also we may as well being part of a big national security archive. So where does that stop? And I think we've seen that with concern with what is happening in China, where the People's Liberation Army has now been implementing for a few years now a full military-civil fusion strategy. That means that civilian data is not exempt from the national security classification, so allowing the army to access massive civilian data sets. And then that includes Chinese citizens, even foreign users of Chinese platforms. And all this data can be accessed and used by the army. But then that means that the default is that every single data set on each individual is part of the army military national strategy and under its rubric.
This is the thing I find most fascinating. And so what do we do? It was interesting when we started talking about China, and so many things came to mind. Of course, TikTok came to mind, but also the Biden administration when they took positions similar to our own on saying the Chinese car firms in America should not be trusted because they might exploit the data for nefarious purposes. That sounds like what you're talking about. Now, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but I'm curious if that is the new landscape, and you add to that this is a lot of the motivation for American firms to grab as much data because they're trying to compete against China. What are the rules that we can apply? Like, where are the lines that we can draw to regulate this? Like, stopping is one thing, but I think to regulating this, because it's not, hope isn't all lost on this, right?
Oh, what gives me most hope actually is exactly what you talked about right now, which is the fact that we can exploit those data sets and our allies means that our enemies can do as well. And it's becoming, there are more and more reporting and studies demonstrating that actually it's not only about the everyday civilian users' data that can be purchased by armies and exploited, but actually military personnel and veterans' data have been actually purchased and can be accessed by our enemies. So there's been instances where, for instance, a company told a US politician that they had data on German soldiers that they purchased from a Lithuanian company. US military veterans' data from their fitness apps, from their day-to-day apps, have been found by the Duke University to have been fully available in the data sets purchased quite cheaply from data broker companies. These are companies that they are amassing, aggregating, and reselling data sets on people. So this gives me hopes in the sense that there is this realization right now that it is not only an opportunity, but it is a threat as well. So I'm hoping that this will motivate both militaries and politicians to better regulate this world. And the regulation, the way we see it, cannot come just from one treaty or one legal instrument. So Serhat spoke about how he was in Geneva to discuss lethal autonomous weapon systems, the regulation. This alone cannot solve the reality we are facing today. Also, the EU passed the AI Act, which, by the way, excludes national security from its application. That alone cannot solve it. It is just more of the concerted effort and understanding of different legal frameworks and sectors, and the exchange of information, understanding how they operate not only alone, but in coordination with each other, that we believe we can build a world where we can rely on for rule of law and human rights protections for our futures. So in that regard, we are working with different organizations that they bring along different expertise to better understand what solutions can be brought forward.
So this project of ours at PI, Militarization of Technology, it brings together so many actors that are experts in their own area, and their expertise really matters because the militarization phenomena is really complex to understand and uncover in all its aspects. So with these organizations that we are working together, we are analyzing, thanks to their hard work and expertise, for example, real life case studies of militarization in different contexts around the world, gendered impacts of these systems in armed conflict, but also in peacetime, legal and policy frameworks around exports, but also uses of these technologies in civic spaces. And there are collaborators who are diving into private firms that are involved in this trade and much more. So we are hoping that this body of knowledge we are collectively creating will inform not only the public, but also the policymakers to prioritize addressing this issue with a human rights lens as a priority.
The one thing I'll take away with a lot of hope is the fact that Ilia is hopeful. And it reminds me, by the time people are listening to this, a little bit of time has passed, but last week, the Danish interior minister was arguing that and encryption over chat and messaging apps was a problem and must be gotten rid of. And I thought it was ironic that it was the Danish minister for the interior arguing that while Danes use a messaging system built by American firms, that they don't want a layer of security protecting Danish citizens from having their communications monitored at a time where the president of the United States is talking about invading Greenland, which is a Danish part of the God, I don't know the right words to describe Greenland's relationship with Denmark, but that in its own right is problematic. So it just feels like PI and the work that we do, we're so accustomed to interior ministries or justice ministers saying and doing stupid things. And I got the impression from Ilia that, like, as much as the national security framing can take away so many rights and make it harder for us to do our work, this militarization and national security framing is actually an opportunity for people who understand attack surfaces and risk very well to step in and say, no, we can't allow this Wild West to continue. We actually need to secure our societies. And I think there's this opportunity with these organizations we're working with to secure in a way that doesn't lock out human rights and other fundamental democratic safeguards. Is that a fair hope, Ilia, just to close off?
Yes, a little bit more pro-military than would be my taste, but
here I am. This is how long I've been in this business. I'm looking for friends anywhere I can find them. And there was a time I was hoping intelligence agencies would step up and say, oh no, for the national security of our people, we must make sure our infrastructure is secure. They didn't do that, at least not in the United Kingdom. They do that a little bit in the US. But and now I'm hoping the armies will save us. That's pretty sad.
someone needs to be the responsible adult. Let's see. It's a brave new world.
It's a brave new world.
It's a brave new world. Well, with that, thank you so much for joining us today. This is a conversation we've wanted to have for a long time, and it's about time. So I look forward to seeing more of this work, and particularly the work with the other organizations who are, arms control organizations, and what their take on all of this is. And the killer robots conversation. Jesus, that is dark, but yeah, we remain hopeful. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you found this topic as interesting as I did, and Caitlin did as well, I think, right? The reason I went off script here is because militarization is just something that fascinates me so deeply. And as I said, I'm so grateful we had the chance to talk to our colleagues about this. And they have been so busy trying to explain and explore this topic that there's bucket loads of content now available on our website and through other means. So I strongly urge you to go and sign up to our mailing list for updates on this specific topic. There's a very specific mailing list that we've started around the militarization of tech, for instance. And you can do so by going to pvcy.org/podsignup. We'll also include relevant links to all the articles that we've been crafting that are relevant to the issues discussed, and also some news articles and reports from others that we raised in this discussion. And we'll add that to the description wherever you're listening, or on our website at pvcy.org/techpill. Don't forget to rate and subscribe to the podcast on whichever platform you use. Music is courtesy of Sepia. This podcast was produced by Max Burnell for Privacy International.